On March 20th, 1995, a Monday afternoon somewhere in Burke, Virginia, a telephone rang in a hospital room. A woman picked it up. Her name was Donna. She looked at the man lying in the bed beside her husband. The man who had once stood 6 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 364 pounds. The man who had body slammed Andre the Giant. The man who had won the Royal Rumble. The man who had stood in the center of the ring at the very first WrestleMania with 15,000 screaming fans watching his every move. He could not speak. His wife held the phone to his ear. On the other end of the line was his closest friend in the world, a man named superstar Billy Graham, calling from Phoenix, Arizona. Graham had just stepped off an airplane. He had felt something during the flight, a heaviness, a burden, an overwhelming need to call his friend one more time. And so he called. And Donna put the phone to her husband's ear. And Big John Studd, the man who had terrorized the World Wrestling Federation for the better part of a decade, the man who had declared himself the true giant of professional wrestling, the man who had fought cancer with the same stubborn refusal to lose that had defined his entire career, lay there in silence, unable to form words, unable to respond. The only thing Graham could hear on the other end of the line was breathing, slow, labored, the breathing of a man who was running out of time. Graham spoke to him softly. He told him not to be afraid. He told him to go ahead and meet the Lord. He told him everything was going to be all right. 2 hours later, John William Minton was dead. He was 46 years old. Some accounts say 47. The math depends on whether you count the birthday he had just barely missed seeing one more time. Either way, it was far, far too young. And the story of how he got there, how a man that impossibly large and impossibly strong was reduced to silence in a hospital bed, unable to even say goodbye to his best friend, is one of the most tragic stories in the history of professional wrestling. But to understand the final 48 hours of Big John Studd, you need to understand the 17 months that preceded them. And to understand those 17 months, you need to understand the man himself. Because this isn't just a story about cancer, this is a story about a man who refused to accept that anything could beat him, who fought with everything he had, long after the doctors had given up hope, long after the odds had turned impossible, long after his body had begun to betray him in ways that would have broken most people. And in the end, it was that same stubbornness, that same iron will, that same refusal to quit that made his final hours so devastating. Because Big John Studd never accepted that he was going to die. Not once. Not even at the very end. John William Minton was born on February 19, 1948, on a farm in Butler, Pennsylvania. Butler is a small city about 35 miles north of Pittsburgh. Working class, blue collar. The kind of place where people do not complain about their problems because everybody has problems and nobody wants to hear about yours. You put your head down, you work hard, you handle your business. That mentality shaped everything about the man John Minton would become. He attended Butler High School, where he played basketball, and even as a teenager, his size was something people talked about. He was not just tall, he was big in a way that made other big people look average. The kind of kid who walked into a room and changed the geometry of the space around him. After high school, Minton did not go straight into wrestling. He joined the United States Army and served as a military police officer in Vietnam. Think about that for a moment. Before he ever stepped into a wrestling ring, before he ever put on the tights and the boots and became Big John Studd, he was a soldier, a military policeman in a war zone. That experience, that discipline, that toughness forged in actual combat would inform everything that came after. When he came home from Vietnam, Minton found his way to professional wrestling. He was trained by a man named Killer Kowalski, one of the most legendary figures in the history of the business. Kowalski saw something in this enormous kid from Pennsylvania. He saw potential. He saw someone who could carry the business on his back, literally and figuratively. And he was not wrong. Minton also trained under Charlie Moto in Los Angeles. Between Kowalski's technical discipline and the rough-and-tumble education of the early 1970s independent scene, Minton was being shaped into something formidable. And it was during these early years in California that he crossed paths with a man who would become the most important friend of his life, superstar Billy Graham. The two of them teamed together in a memorable series of matches against Chris and John Tolos, and something clicked between them immediately. Graham later said they instantly hit it off, that there was a connection that went beyond the business. It was a friendship that would last for 2 decades and carry both men through some of the darkest chapters of their lives. Graham would go on to battle his own health problems stemming from steroid abuse. And Stud would lean on Graham during the worst of his cancer fight. But in those early days in California, they were just 2 young guys trying to make it in the wrestling business, with no idea how closely their futures would be intertwined. Minton debuted in 1972 under the name The Mighty Minton, wrestling on the independent circuit in Los Angeles. He quickly moved to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, wrestling as Chuck O'Connor. He was raw, he was green, but he was impossible to ignore. By 1976, he had returned to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, this time wearing a mask as Executioner number 2, teaming with his mentor Kowalski. Together, they won the WWE World Tag Team Championship, defeating Tony Parisi and Louis Serdin. It was his first taste of gold, his first real moment in the spotlight. But the name that would make him famous had not arrived yet. That came in the late 1970s when Houston promoter Paul Boesch looked at this massive human being standing in front of him and said 5 words that would change everything. "My God, you look like a stud." Big John Studd was born, and from that moment on, the wrestling world would never be the same. Studd moved through the territories like a force of nature: Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, the American Wrestling Association. He won tag team titles with partners like Ric Flair, Ken Patera, and Bull Ramos. He challenged for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. He feuded with Dusty Rhodes, Blackjack Mulligan, and Barry Windham. Everywhere he went, he dominated. Everywhere he went, he drew money. Because people wanted to see someone try to knock down this mountain of a man, and very few could. But it was his return to the World Wrestling Federation in late 1982 that turned Big John Studd from a regional star into a national phenomenon. Paired with manager Freddie Blassie, Studd developed a gimmick that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. He would bring a stretcher to the ring before every match. The message was clear. He was not just going to beat you, he was going to hurt you so badly that you would need to be carried out of the building on that stretcher. And more often than not, that is exactly what happened. But it was his feud with Andre the Giant that made Studd a household name. This was the collision that the wrestling world had been waiting for. 2 genuine giants, 2 men who dwarfed everyone else in the locker room, going to war over who deserved to be called the true giant of professional wrestling. Studd wore 4-inch lifts in his boots to close the height gap with Andre. He declared that no man alive could body slam him. He offered $10,000, later $15,000, to any wrestler who could prove him wrong. The stakes of the feud were enormous. If Andre could not slam Studd before the time limit expired, or if Studd managed to slam Andre, then Andre the Giant would be forced to retire from professional wrestling. That was the stipulation. That was what made the crowd at Madison Square Garden hold its breath when both men stood in the ring at the very first WrestleMania in 1985. Millions of people were watching around the world. The atmosphere inside the Garden was electric. And when Andre the Giant reached down, grabbed Big John Studd around the waist, and hoisted all 364 pounds of him into the air before slamming him down to the mat, the building erupted. The sound was deafening. It was one of those moments that transcended wrestling. One of those moments where the boundary between performance and reality dissolved completely, and every single person watching felt something genuine. History was made that night, and Big John Studd's place in wrestling immortality was secured forever, not because he won, but because he was the man on the other side of one of the most iconic images the business has ever produced. The feud with Andre continued after WrestleMania. It evolved and took on new dimensions. Stud and his ally, King Kong Bundy, attacked Andre, injuring his sternum. The warfare between them produced some of the most memorable television of the entire era. When Andre's health began to decline due to the effects of acromegaly and gigantism, the two men found themselves on opposite sides once more in the famous Machine storyline, where Andre donned a mask and wrestled as the Giant Machine, while Stud and Heenan desperately tried to prove his true identity. Stud was a member of Bobby Heenan's infamous Heenan family, alongside Ken Patera and King Kong Bundy. He feuded with Hulk Hogan for the WWE Championship. He participated in the Battle Royal at WrestleMania 2, going head-to-head with NFL players and fellow wrestlers alike. He was a constant, commanding presence in the main event scene of the most watched wrestling promotion on the planet. And through it all, his rivalry with Andre remained the defining story of his career. Two giants, two mountains, colliding again and again in arenas across the country, each one trying to prove that he was the biggest, the strongest, the most dominant force in professional wrestling. And then, in 1989, came the crowning achievement of his career, the Royal Rumble. 30 men entered that ring in Houston, Texas. 29 of them were eliminated, and when the dust settled, the last man standing was Big John Studd. He had outlasted everyone. He had won the most prestigious battle royal in professional wrestling. And for those who were paying attention that night, who looked closely at the expression on Studd's face when his hand was raised in victory, there was something there that went beyond kayfabe, something real, something that said this moment mattered, that after years of being the villain, after years of being the man the fans loved to hate, this victory meant everything to him. He served as the special guest referee at WrestleMania 5 that year, overseeing the match between Andre the Giant and Jake the Snake Roberts. It was the last major spotlight moment of his career. He left the WWE a few months later, in June of 1989, and worked a handful of independent dates before stepping away from the ring for what everyone assumed would be a quiet retirement. But retirement, as it so often does in professional wrestling, did not last. Studd made occasional appearances throughout the early 1990s. He picked up some acting work, appearing in the film Harley-Davidson and The Marlboro Man in 1991. He fell off a motorcycle during filming, an injury that would add to the growing list of physical problems his body was accumulating after nearly 2 decades of professional wrestling. Then came October 1993, and everything changed. Studd had been asked to fill in for Jimmy Snuka at an independent show promoted by his old mentor, Killer Kowalski, in the Boston area. He agreed. It was supposed to be a simple night, a quick match, in and out, no big deal, but during the match, something was wrong. Studd was winded, not just tired, but genuinely struggling to breathe. He had no stamina. For a man who had gone 30 minutes in the ring with Andre the Giant, who had survived Royal Rumbles and cage matches and steel cage brawls, to be gasping for air after a few minutes of basic wrestling was alarming. He knew something was off. He could feel it in his bones. After the match, while taking a shower, he felt a lump under his armpit. Just a small knot of tissue that had not been there before. He pressed on it. It did not hurt, but it was there. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the alarm bells started ringing. He went to the doctor. They ran tests. And what they found was devastating. A large tumor sitting right in the middle of his chest. Hodgkin's disease. And just like that, the greatest fight of Big John Studd's life began. Not in the ring, not under the lights, but in hospital rooms and doctors' offices and chemotherapy wards, against an opponent that did not care how big he was, did not care how tough he was, did not care how many Royal Rumbles he had won. His doctors believed the disease may have been triggered, or at least accelerated, by his long-time use of human growth hormone. During his years in the WWE, Studd had taken human growth hormone to increase his already massive size. He was concerned about being a role model to kids, so he kept his substance use a secret, only admitting it to his closest inner circle. His friend Billy Graham later revealed that Stud had been open about his human growth hormone use in private, even while publicly denying it. He went to high schools and spoke to young people about staying clean, and his philosophy was that admitting his own drug use would give kids the green light to try it themselves. But now the potential consequences of those choices were staring him in the face, and the timing could not have been worse. Because in 1994, while Stud was fighting for his life against Hodgkin's disease, he was also subpoenaed to testify in the Vince McMahon federal steroid trial. He was too weak from cancer treatments to appear in person at the courthouse in Long Island, so the court allowed him to testify by telephone from his home. He finally admitted publicly, under oath, what he had denied for years: that he had used steroids purchased from WWE ringside physician Dr. George Zahorian during the 1980s. It was a remarkable moment. A man on what might be his deathbed, forced to confront the choices of his past while simultaneously fighting the consequences of those very choices. The irony was almost too cruel to be real. But Stud wasn't thinking about irony. He was thinking about survival. The first round of chemotherapy sent the cancer into remission. His doctors told him that if things continued to go well, he might even be able to wrestle again in 6 months. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Big John Stud was going to beat this thing. That the same iron will that had carried him through Vietnam, through 20 years of professional wrestling, through some of the most physically punishing matches in the history of the business, was going to carry him through cancer too. But the cancer came back. It always comes back. That's the cruel reality of Hodgkin's disease. It retreats. It lets you think you've won. It lets you start planning for the future. And then it returns, stronger and more aggressive than before. When the tumor returned in 1994, the doctors told Stud that his only chance was a bone marrow transplant. They searched for a suitable donor. They searched everywhere. But no match could be found, and without a transplant, they told him he had approximately 1 month to live. 1 month. Most people would have given up at that point. Most people would have made their peace, said their goodbyes, and prepared for the end. But John Minton was not most people. He had never given up on anything in his life. He wasn't about to start now. There was one other option, an auto-transplantation procedure where they would extract his own bone marrow, treat it, and transplant it back into his body. The procedure had a success rate of 7%. 7%. That means that 93 out of every 100 people who underwent the procedure did not survive it. The odds were astronomical. The chances of success were barely worth discussing. Stud didn't care about the odds. He never had. He told the doctors to do it. And against all reason, against all medical probability, against everything the statistics said should have happened, it worked. The cancer went into remission again. The 7% success rate, and Big John Stud was on the right side of it. He went home. He saw his wife Donna. He saw his 3 children, Robert, Janelle, and Sean. For a few precious months, he was alive in a way that the doctors had told him he would never be again. Billy Graham later described this period with something approaching awe. The man had beaten odds that would have destroyed anyone else. He had stared death in the face, and death had blinked first. Graham believed that Stud's sheer willpower, his absolute refusal to accept defeat, had somehow willed his body to respond to a treatment that almost never worked. But the reprieve was temporary. Around September of 1994, Stud's lungs collapsed. He was rushed back to the hospital. The night sweats returned. The fevers came back. Every morning, he would wake up feeling sick. Every symptom that had signaled the cancer's first appearance was now screaming at him again, louder than before. And then came the fever. 108.5 degrees. The doctors had never seen anything like it. A temperature that high should cause brain damage, should cause organ failure, should kill a person outright. But Stud survived it. Again. His body, that incredible beaten-down, cancer-ravaged body that had been through 2 decades of professional wrestling and multiple rounds of chemotherapy and a bone marrow transplant with a 7% success rate, somehow absorbed a fever of 108.5 degrees and kept going. He spent nearly 5 months in the hospital during 1994, 20 weeks, almost half a year, fighting every single day, never giving up, never accepting that this disease was going to take him. His friend Graham visited when he could and called constantly, and during those final months, something had shifted in Stud. He had found religion. He and Graham would talk about God, about faith, about what comes after. Graham later said that Stud had developed a tremendous energy towards God during the last 6 months of his life, that he would call specifically to talk about the Lord, that he told Graham he had no fear of death because he was going to heaven. But even as Stud was making spiritual preparations, he never stopped believing he would beat the cancer. He held both truths simultaneously, the way only someone with that kind of will can. He was ready to meet God, but he was also planning to walk out of that hospital. In February of 1995, Stud returned for what would be his final round of chemotherapy. And this time, the news was catastrophic. The tumor hadn't just returned, it had spread. Everywhere, through his body, through his organs. The cancer had eaten holes through his liver. It had metastasized beyond any hope of containment. The doctors told Stud that if the chemotherapy didn't work this time, he had about a week to live. A week. From winning the Royal Rumble to being told he had 7 days. From body slamming the biggest men on the planet to being unable to lift himself out of a hospital bed. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. But even then, even with that prognosis hanging over him like a death sentence, Stud remained positive. When he was admitted to the hospital for the final time, he told Billy Graham that he would be out in about 5 days. 5 days. He genuinely believed it. He wasn't putting on a brave face. He wasn't trying to comfort his family. He truly, deeply, fundamentally believed that he was going to walk out of that hospital. That he was going to beat this thing one more time. He would never leave. And that's the part of this story that breaks your heart if you let it. Because while the wrestling world knew Big John Studd as a character, as a villain, as a giant who terrorized the WWE for years, the man in that hospital bed was not a character. He was a husband. He was a father. His wife, Donna Conklin, a former competitive swimmer, had met him at the Le Pichet restaurant in Montreal. The restaurant, in one of those strange twists that only the wrestling world could produce, was co-owned by none other than Andre the Giant himself. The man Studd had spent years feuding with in the ring was indirectly responsible for introducing him to the love of his life. They married in 1978 and raised 3 children together. Donna had managed the household while John traveled the world, 300 days a year, from territory to territory, from arena to arena. She had held things together at home while he was out there making a living in one of the most demanding professions on earth. And now she was holding things together in a hospital room, watching the strongest man she had ever known fade away. Their children, Robert, Janelle, and Sean, were still young enough to need their father, young enough that his absence would shape the rest of their lives. And somewhere in that hospital room during those final days, the weight of that truth must have been suffocating. And now we arrive at the final 48 hours of Big John Studd's life, the last weekend of his existence on this earth, Friday, March 17th, 1995. This appears to be the last day that Big John Studd could communicate clearly. He was in the hospital. The chemotherapy was failing. His body was shutting down, system by system, the cancer having spread so far and so deep that there was nothing left for the medicine to target. Graham called him on Friday, and Studd told him something that revealed, for the first time, that some part of him understood what was happening. He told Graham that the doctors had said if the chemotherapy did not work, he had about a week to live. It was delivered in a matter-of-fact way, not with self-pity, not with despair, just information. the way a soldier reports a battlefield assessment, the way a wrestler talks about a bad match. Here's the situation, here's what we're dealing with. But there was also something else in that conversation, something Graham would think about for years afterward. Even as Stud was relaying this prognosis, even as he was telling his best friend that the doctors had given him days, there was no surrender in his voice, no acceptance. He was still fighting, still planning to be one of the ones who beat the odds. Just like he had beaten the 7%, just like he had survived a 108-degree fever, just like he had survived everything the business and life and his own choices had thrown at him for 46 years. That Friday conversation would be the last time Billy Graham heard John Minton form coherent words. Saturday, March 18th, 1995. Graham called again. He was preparing to travel to Raleigh, North Carolina, where he had been invited to speak at a church the following day. Stud's condition was deteriorating rapidly now. The cancer was advancing with a speed that defied even the doctor's worst predictions. What had been projected as a week was collapsing into days, into hours. The details of Saturday are sparse. What we know is that Stud was still alive, still in the hospital, still presumably refusing to give up, even as his body was systematically failing. His wife Donna was there, his family was there. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind, the terrible truth was settling in. The truth that Big John Stud had spent 17 months refusing to accept. Sunday, March 19th, 1995. Graham was in Raleigh, speaking at his church engagement. He called Stud that day. And this time, something had changed. Stud was unable to talk. The man who had cut some of the most memorable promos in wrestling history, the man who had stood in the center of the ring and declared himself the true giant of professional wrestling with enough conviction to make you believe it, could no longer form words. Think about what that means. Think about the progression. On Friday, he was talking, communicating, delivering information about his prognosis with the clarity and composure of a man who had stared down Andre the Giant. By Sunday, 2 days later, he was silent. The cancer had advanced that quickly, had stolen that much from him in 48 hours. Graham knew. In that moment, standing in Raleigh, hundreds of miles from his friend, he knew. The fighter was losing his final fight. The mountain was crumbling. The giant was falling. Monday, March 20th, 1995. Graham boarded a plane back to Phoenix. During that flight, something happened to him that he would later describe as a burden. Not sadness exactly, not grief. A burden, a weight pressing down on his chest, an overwhelming compulsion to call his friend one more time. He couldn't explain it. He just knew he had to make that call. As soon as he got home, before he unpacked, before he did anything else, he picked up the phone and dialed the hospital. Donna answered. She put the phone to John's ear. He couldn't speak, but Graham could hear him breathing. And so Graham did the talking. For both of them, for the last time. He told his friend not to be afraid. He told him to go ahead and meet the Lord. He told him that everything they had discussed in those long conversations about faith and God and what comes after was real, that it was waiting for him, that he didn't need to be scared. Whether Stud heard those words, whether his mind could still process language in those final hours, we will never know. All Graham heard was breathing, slow and steady, in and out, the sound of a man holding on to life by the thinnest possible thread. 2 hours after that phone call, Big John Stud died, the man who had fought for 17 months, the man who had survived a 7% procedure, the man who had endured a fever of 108 degrees without brain damage, the man who had spent 20 weeks in the hospital in a single year, the man who had been told he would die in a month and lived for another year after that, the man who, even as he was being admitted for the final time, told his friend he would be out in 5 days. He was gone. The news spread through the wrestling world like a shockwave. Todd Pettengill announced Stud's passing on the March 26, 1995 episode of WWE Action Zone. For many fans watching at home, it was the first they had heard of Stud's illness. He had kept his battle private. He had fought it the same way he had lived his entire life. Quietly, stubbornly, without asking for sympathy or attention. The wrestling community mourned, but they also reflected. Because Big John Stud's death was not just a tragedy, it was a warning. A cautionary tale about the price that an entire generation of professional wrestlers was paying for the choices they made during the boom years of the 1980s. The steroids, the human growth hormone, the punishing schedule, the toll that traveling 300 days a year takes on a human body. The culture that demanded these men be bigger, stronger, more imposing than nature ever intended them to be. Stud's doctors had told him that his excessive use of human growth hormone, which had reshaped his skeleton and muscles during his years feuding with Andre, may have been the trigger for his tumors, may have been what started the chain of events that ended on March 20th, 1995, in a hospital bed in Virginia. He wasn't the first wrestler to die young, and he wouldn't be the last. The list of professional wrestlers from that era who died before their 50th birthday is long enough to fill its own documentary. But Stud's death hit particularly hard because of who he was. Not just the character, but the man. Because by all accounts, John Minton was a good person, a family man, a father, someone who cared deeply about being a role model, even as he was secretly using the very substances he warned kids to avoid. Billy Graham described Stud as somewhat of a loner in the wrestling profession. He wasn't a guy who ran with the boys after the shows. He wasn't hanging out at bars and getting into trouble on the road. He was the guy who called home every night. The guy who kept to himself. The guy who, when he wasn't performing, was thinking about his wife and his kids and the life he was building outside of the ring. Graham said that despite being a loner professionally, Stud was intensely loyal to the few people he let into his inner circle. And once you were in that circle, once you had earned his trust and his friendship, he would do anything for you. That loyalty ran in both directions. Graham drove that point home by staying in constant contact with Stud throughout his entire cancer battle, even as his own health was declining from years of steroid abuse. And towards the end of Stud's life, their friendship took on a new, deeper dimension. They talked about faith, about God, about eternity. Graham, who had found religion after his own health crises, became a spiritual guide for Stud in those final months. He witnessed to him, they prayed together over the phone. And Stud, this massive, imposing figure who had spent his career projecting toughness and invincibility, opened himself up to something larger than himself. He told Graham he had no fear of death because he knew where he was going. He said he was going to heaven. There's an almost Shakespearean quality to the broader contradiction of his life. A man who loved children so much that he spent his time outside the ring visiting high schools and speaking to kids about making good choices. A man who kept his drug use hidden specifically because he didn't want to give young people permission to follow in his footsteps. And yet, the substances he used in secret to maintain his size, to compete in an industry that rewarded physical extremity above almost everything else, may have been what killed him. He died in Burke, Virginia. He was buried at Saxonburg Memorial Church Cemetery in Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, not far from the small town where he had grown up, where he had played basketball at Butler High School, where a kid who would grow up to stand 6 feet 10 inches tall first dreamed of something bigger than a farm in western Pennsylvania. His wife Donna survived him. His 3 children survived him. His son Sean would follow in his father's footsteps, becoming a professional wrestler under the ring name Big Sean Stud. His son John Minton Jr. participated in the 4th season of WWE Tough Enough, carrying the family legacy into a new generation of the business. In 1995, the same year he died, Stud was inducted into the WCW Hall of Fame. In 2004, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, with his son accepting the honor on his behalf. 2 halls of fame. 2 permanent recognitions of a career that spanned more than 2 decades and produced some of the most memorable moments in the history of professional wrestling. But here's what stays with you when you think about the final 48 hours of Big John Studd. It's not the career highlights, it's not the Royal Rumble victory or the WrestleMania match or the Tag Team Championships. It's not even the cancer diagnosis or the impossible odds or the failed chemotherapy. It's the phone call. It's Billy Graham sitting in his home in Phoenix after a long flight from North Carolina, feeling that inexplicable burden, that pull, that need to call one more time. It's Donna holding the phone to her husband's ear because he could no longer hold it himself. It's Graham hearing nothing but breathing on the other end of the line and knowing with absolute certainty that these were his friend's final hours. It's the words he chose to say. Don't be afraid. Go ahead and meet the Lord. 2 hours later, it was over. There's a passage in the Bible that talks about fighting the good fight, about finishing the race, about keeping the faith. Billy Graham used a version of those words when he spoke about his friend after his death. He fought the good fight, Graham said, and he meant it. Not just the cancer fight, the whole fight, the 20-year career, the Vietnam service, the fatherhood, the marriages, the rivalries, all of it. One long fight from start to finish, and maybe that's the real lesson of Big John Studd's final 48 hours. That the way a person dies tells you everything about how they lived. Studd lived like a fighter. He died like one too, never surrendering, never accepting defeat, still believing, right up to the very last moment, that he was going to walk out of that hospital and prove everyone wrong one more time. He didn't, but the fact that he believed it, the fact that even cancer couldn't break his spirit, the fact that the last thing he heard on this earth was his best friend telling him not to be afraid, tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man John William Minton was. 6 feet 10 inches tall, 364 pounds, winner of the 1989 Royal Rumble, nemesis of Andre the Giant, member of the Heenan family, Vietnam veteran, father of 3, Hall of Famer, gone at 46. The professional wrestling business has lost many of its own over the years. Too many. And each loss carries its own particular weight, its own specific gravity of sadness. But there's something about Big John Studd's story that lingers. Maybe it's because he died so privately, without the fanfare or the media attention that accompanied other wrestling deaths. Maybe it's because the details of his final days are so painfully human, so stripped of the spectacle and the pageantry that defined his career. Or maybe it's because, in the end, Big John Studd was just a man, an extraordinarily large man, an extraordinarily talented man, an extraordinarily stubborn man, but just a man, lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to hold a telephone, listening to his best friend's voice telling him that everything was going to be okay, and maybe, just maybe, believing it. The professional wrestling business learned something from Big John Studd's death. It would take years and many more deaths before the lessons truly sank in. But the conversation about substance abuse, about the toll the business takes on the human body, about the responsibility that promoters have to the men and women who destroy themselves for the entertainment of millions, that conversation has to include the name of John William Minton. Because he didn't just die of cancer. He died of an era. He died of a culture. He died of expectations that no human body could meet without chemical assistance. And the tragedy isn't just that he's gone. The tragedy is that he knew, at least on some level, that the choices he made in the 1980s might be connected to what was happening to his body in the 1990s. And he made those choices anyway, because the business demanded it, because the fans expected it, because standing eye to eye with Andre the Giant required more than nature had given him. That doesn't make him a villain. It makes him a product of his time, a casualty of an industry that chewed through human bodies like they were disposable. And in the end, despite all the championships and the Hall of Fame inductions and the iconic moments, that might be the most important thing about Big John Studd's legacy. Not what he accomplished, but what it cost him. It cost him everything. Rest in peace, John. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.